for people who are watching the live broadcast to find us. And let me make sure that we are indeed reaching both Facebook and YouTube. How are we doing? Where are you tuning in from? I love it, by the way, people who are watching us later on the replay, that you've in the comments mentioned that you're watching on the replay and watching it later and where you're tuning in from. It's great for us. It's a community. Not everybody can watch it live, and yet we are all joined together by our learning, and so that's beautiful. Okay, we are live on Facebook. And we are live on YouTube. Beautiful. Who's in the house? Where are you tuning in from? Look at this. Sodfa Sophie says, hello from Egypt. Welcome, Sodfa. So glad that you're with us. Brian de Bloomfield says, Shabbat Shalom from Massachusetts. Cheryl Lanther is in the house from League City, Texas. Welcome. George Gagnidze, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing, says Shabbat Shalom from Toronto. Christo Cheney in the house from Lubbock, Texas. Always being sure I catch the replays, and it's great that you're with us live. Yehudit Sobel in the house from Florence, South Carolina. Randy Lieberman Harriman, Shabbat Shalom from Florida. Guy Thomas Kennedy from Dayton, Ohio. Johnny Ogletree is in the house. Lynn Job in the house from North Texas. All right. It's so great that we're all together and learning. And Sodfa from Egypt says, love for all. We're sending you love right back. Okay. Let us light up the darkness. Beautiful. Before we go any further, I want to dedicate our learning today. I just had a beautiful, beautiful phone call with my friend Sarah Bremen. She lives in Mexico City, Mexico, and El DF, if you speak Spanish. Nina and I met Sarah and her husband Pablo at the national retreat, the Chabad National Retreat, a couple years ago. And, it's been tough in Mexico City. They have the pandemic just like everywhere else. And just a couple days ago, they had a big earthquake. I mean, it was a scary big earthquake. I think it was a little closer to Oaxaca than Mexico City, but it was serious and scary. But what Sarah called to tell me about is that now Sarah is a master baker. She makes challahs, and in fact, she used to travel around the world leading big challah bakes, for hundreds of women in various communities around the world. Once everybody got locked in, so then she thought, what can I do? What can I do? How can I be of help to people? And she started making little care packages built around a challah, one of her homemade challahs. You should be blessed that you get to try Sarah Bremen's challah. It's the second best challah in the world after my wife Nina's. But it's amazing what she does. And she made these little packages with this fresh baked challah and a couple of candles and some grape juice so people can light the Shabbos candles and make a kiddush. And then she's delivering them to senior citizens all over Mexico City. I mean, especially people in their 80s and 90s. Some of them are older people, who spoke Yiddish in their youth, who are now isolated and not seeing their children and their families, and haven't celebrated Shabbos, and some of them in decades. People who are really disconnected from Judaism. And then they receive this beautiful, fresh challah that reminds them of their mom's challah, back in the old world. Some of them, got to Mexico before or after World War II. And they're so moved that somebody's thinking about them and caring about them, and that they receive this challah that reminds them of their moms. And I mean, Sarah has just touched so many people. She said she's baked about 300 challahs in the last 3 months. To send to people. She sends them out on Thursdays and Fridays, so they have them for Shabbos in Mexico City. And people are just weeping with joy and lighting Shabbos candles for the first time in decades. And so we want to just honor Sarah. May she be able to keep doing these deliveries and these gifts and touching people's souls. She's the challah angel of Mexico City, and may she be strengthened to keep up this important and beautiful work until she's 120 years old. We love you, Sarah. May God bless you and smile on you, and we're dedicating today's learning to you. Okay. All right. What are we doing? We are holding on Daf Kuf Yud Beis. That's page 112 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 15, and today we're going to be discussing Mishnah number 2 and its Gemaras. Okay, so Mishnah number 1 of chapter 15 was a very short Mishnah, a short discussion, and it was really about professional knots, right? That a sailor or a camel driver, if they would make a knot that is a professional knot, meaning a knot that is going to be permanent, the kind of knot that is going to attach a ring to a camel's nose or an iron ring to the bow of a ship, those attachments are meant to be permanent. It's not the rope that you use to tie the camel or the rope that you use to tie the ship to the dock. This is a permanent knot that is going to attach that ring to the ship or the ring to the camel. And it's just meant to, be a knot that's so strong it never falls out or needs to be replaced, at least until the rope wears out. That kind of a knot, if you tied it on Shabbos, you would be violating the prohibition on tying knots on Shabbos, and you would, you'd have to bring the sin offering if you committed that transgression unwittingly. You'd be liable to bring the sin offering. But if you tied, your shoelaces on Shabbos, that's perfectly permitted, right? And so that's permitted. And then the question was, well, what about knots that are meant to be permanent but are not professional knots? So that there we get into the situation where it's exempt from liability for violating a Torah prohibition. You wouldn't have to bring a sin offering if you did that unwittingly, but prohibited by rabbinic decree. That's where we were yesterday. Today we're going to do Mishnah number 2. This follows quite closely on Mishnah number 1, and we're still learning about knots, and it's going to be another aspect and nuance of this lesson. Now, yesterday at the end of the class, somebody said in the comments, doesn't this learning seem a little trivial to you, that we're spending so much time and attention learning about the particulars of this kind of knot versus that kind of knot, and which is exempt from bringing a sin offering but prohibited, and which is actually permitted. And it's a lot of really nuanced and technical type of discussion. And so this person asked, is that trivial? And my answer was, no, not at all. It is not trivial at all. Why? Because in the same way that when we study an emotional Bible story, and then we try to take the lessons out of that story, when we learn about Joseph and his brothers, and the fact that Joseph was young and arrogant and, sort of lorded it over his brothers because he had these visions, and they grew to become so, and his father was so, treated him like such a favorite, and eventually the older brothers sold him into slavery, and what a disaster. And yet that sequence of events is what ultimately led Joseph to be in Egypt and to become, the second most powerful man in the world and save his family and all the Jews who were saved from the famine. When we read that kind of a story, nobody asks, oh, isn't that story so trivial? Why should we study it? Because we know there's inherent life lessons about relationships and emotionality, and about gratification delayed, about the terrible cost that favoritism and jealousy can impart on a family, etc. Likewise, when we study the laws of the Torah, so that those are the stories in the Torah, but when we study the laws in the Torah and we seek to understand, well, what is God telling us? What are the limitations and the extensions and the parameters of these commandments and prohibitions which are in the Torah, when we dig in and try to understand what exactly is God's will for us, invariably we're also going to learn lessons about ourselves and our families and our society, even today, thousands of years removed from when the sages were discussing these laws. They are not trivial. And by the end of today and our discussion of knots, we're going to find a takeaway that certainly applies to us today. All right, let's get into it. So Mishnah number 2 says, we have knots for which one is not liable, but they're still prohibited. And then the Mishnah goes on to list a bunch of permitted knots, knots that it is permitted ab initio, in other words, knots that one can tie or untie on Shabbos. It's fully permitted to do these. And then the Mishnah lists, these are the knots that is permitted to tie or untie. A woman's robe, a woman's hairnet, knots in a woman's underwear, also the knots with which we tie our shoes or a sandal, or that we use to tie off the spout of a jug that holds wine or oil, a knot that we would use to tie a garment over a pot of meat on Shabbos to keep it warm. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that it is permitted to tie a rope before an animal, not to an animal, but in front of an animal, so that it will not go out on Shabbos. That's the Mishnah. The first thing that the Gemara says is, wait a minute. The Mishnah starts by saying that there are knots that for which one is exempt if he ties or unties them on Shabbos, meaning it's not a biblical transgression. You wouldn't be required to bring a sin offering if you did it unwittingly, and yet they're still prohibited, meaning prohibited by rabbinic decree. The Mishnah states that, but then it goes on and gives a list of permitted knots. So the Gemara says, well, which are the knots that are exempt from being a Torah prohibition, but are still prohibited by the rabbis? And the Gemara answers, these are the knots that a camel driver or a sailor would tie on the other side of the ring. I actually made a amateur hour little drawing here, but let's see if this makes sense. Whoa. Right? If you look up there, I'm sorry, this is backwards, so it's a little bit hard for me to point. Okay. So here, the idea here, one knot that attaches the ring to the ship, a knot that attaches the ring to the ship, that's a permanent knot. For that, you're liable. But the knot that is used to tie the boat to the dock, right, that's a temporary knot while the boat is in the dock. That's the one that is prohibited. You don't make that knot on Shabbos, right? You shouldn't be starting your boat on and off and tying it to the dock on Shabbos. So that's the one that would be exempt, but prohibited. And then if you're talking about like a woman's robe, and that's what I made my other little drawing right here, right there. So that's permitted, right? So in other words, if you've got one of those kind of shirts that has a drawstring and you're going to put on that garment on Shabbos, of course you can tie that knot. That is permitted, and you can untie it. And we learned in the first Mishnah from Rabbi Meir that generally speaking, a knot that you can untie easily with one hand is a knot that is permitted to both tie or untie on Shabbos as a general principle. Okay. With regard to the opening of a robe, so the Gemara says, why does this need to be said? That's obvious. Of course you can tie that kind of a knot. That's what we learned in the first Mishnah. Why does the second Mishnah feel the need to specify that this kind of a knot, which you can easily untie with one hand, why is it going to be listed, specifically? The sage is making us aware that this kind of knot is going to be permitted to tie or untie on Shabbos. And the Gemara answers its question. The reason why the sages list that kind of a knot is because perhaps the woman has a garment that has two openings, right? It has two openings, and she can use one of the openings to tie and untie to get in and out of the garment, but the other one remains tied, and it's intended that it will remain tied. So the question is, the one that stays tied, that she never bothers to tie or untie because she can use the second knot to open and close and get in and out of the garment, with regard to the first knot, the one that stays tied all the time, if she unties that one or she ties that one on Shabbos, is that a permitted knot? And the Gemara says, yes, it is. And that's why it's listed. So when you hear that, so now you would think, this I mentioned in yesterday's class, right? This is my boot, okay? So this is my boot from some training that I do with the Magen Am organization. And this is a, kind of military style boot. And what's interesting about it is it has a zipper here that we open and close to get in and out of the boot. And so the laces here stay tied. So now you might ask, well, if I can get in and out with the zipper, does this knot then become some kind of a permanent knot, which it would certainly not be, you wouldn't be liable for tying it or untying it on Shabbos to bring the sin offering, but perhaps this is the kind of knot that is prohibited by rabbinic decree. Now, if we make an analogy to the woman's robe that has two openings, and one knot stays tied all the time, and the other one is the one that she opens and closes to take it on and off, and yet we know that now both knots of the woman's robe are permitted, so maybe on Shabbos, this knot, which I normally don't touch, I just leave it tied, if I tied it or if I untied it and then retied it on Shabbos, that would seem to be permitted. But let's put a pin in that for a moment. We continue. With regard to a woman's hairnet, the Gemara says, well, this is obvious. It's just this very simple knot, the kind that you can untie with one hand. Why would the Mishnah bother to list this one specifically? Answer, because maybe she makes the hairnet not so tight, and that knot stays tied, and she doesn't tie and untie that knot. She simply takes the whole hairnet and slips it on her head and off her head without untying the knot. If the knot were to remain tied all the time, that's why we would have the question, is it some kind of a permanent knot? Not a professional knot that would incur liability, but still a permanent knot that would be prohibited. And the Gemara says this question is irrelevant because women are much more particular about their hair. They wouldn't leave the knot tied all the time because they would be afraid that the net is going to pull some of their hair out. So of course they tie and untie it. If one particular woman doesn't do that, and that's what you observed that made you ask this question, silly you. Generally speaking, women can tie or untie whatever they want because they're particular about their hair. Now we come to the question of shoes and sandals. And so the Gemara first makes a distinction and it says, well, with regard to the knots of shoes and sandals, it's pretty simple. If we're talking about a knot made by the shoemaker, a knot in the threading, the stitching that keeps the shoe together, or if it's a sandal, a knot that is the permanent knot that keeps the various straps of the sandal together, so that's a permanent professional knot. If you undid or redid such a knot on Shabbos, you'd be liable to bring the sin offering. That's a professional and permanent knot. But all of the shoelaces and straps that you use to get in and out of the sandal, well, of course, that's just like the opening of the woman's robe. That's how you get in and out of the shoe. Of course, that is a temporary and simple knot that you could pull open with one hand. And so that's permitted on Shabbos. That's permitted on Shabbos. But now we hear that some of the sages would keep their sandals a little bit loose. And they wouldn't be so particular like the residents of Mechoza. right? So in Mechoza, there the people were super fashionable, and there they would always be very particular about their clothing. And if they wore sandals, they would loosen all the straps when they take it off, and when they put it on, they would carefully tighten all the straps to get a perfect fit around the ankle and up on the calf, etc. So for sure, they were tying and untying their straps. But some of the sages were much less particular about the fit and look of their sandals, and what they did is they just kept the straps kind of loosely tied, and they never tied or untied those straps. They just slipped the sandal on and off without adjusting the strap. In that case, when somebody makes a pseudo-permanent knot, right? It's not meant to be a permanent knot, but it becomes effectively a permanent knot because they don't tie and untie their shoes. They only slip them on and off. Anybody who has a teenager in the house might find this familiar. They don't tie and untie their shoes, their sneakers. They just kick them on and kick them off, and the laces kind of remain permanently tied. In that situation, we've arrived at a knot that is exempt but prohibited. And so if we come back to my boot, where I get in and out by using the zipper, and this knot, I really never adjust it. It just stays tied like that. In fact, it has even a little bit of a double loop there. Now we have to say, aha, this is not like the opening of a woman's robe. This is much more akin to that permanent knot of the sage's sandals. And so if I tied it or untied it on Shabbos, I wouldn't become liable to bring the sin offering. I'm not liable, but it's still prohibited to tie or untie that knot on Shabbos because it has much more of that permanent quality. Okay. Now we move on. We're still talking, now that we're talking about sandals and shoes and boots, we're going to go into a little bit of a related area which has to do with the ability of a shoe to transmit tumah. So we recall there's been several times in our journey through Tractate Shabbos where we're going to get into issues of tumah and tahor, ritual impurity and purity. So recall that ritual impurity, tumah, is transmitted from a source of impurity like a dead body or a creeping thing or somebody who's had certain discharges from their body. If you come into contact with a source of tumah, depending on how strong that tumah is, like the strongest source of tumah would be a human corpse, and then a little bit weaker would be an animal corpse or a living creeping thing, like a mouse or a cock. I don't know if a cockroach qualifies, but certainly certain insects, and we had a list of 8 animals that transmit tumah. So if you touch those things, then that object becomes impure or the person becomes impure, and then they have to go through a process of purification. And some things cannot be purified, so they would need to be broken and perhaps used for some other purpose. This is not about transmitting disease. This is not about being dirty. This is ritual impurity and ritual purity. Now, this is a different body of law, and we're certainly going to talk a lot about it later in our journey. But now we're discussing about how sometimes there's an intersection between the laws of tahor and tumah and the laws of Shabbos. So, with respect to a sandal, if the inner strap of a sandal breaks, meaning that it's going to be difficult to wear, but it can be fixed and it's still a sandal. So it's Shabbos, and you're walking around and your sandal breaks. The sandal is not ruined, but it needs a repair. You're not going to be able to wear it because the strap that holds it onto your foot has broken. That's called an inner strap. At that point, the sandal is still a utensil, meaning the sandal is still a sandal. And so if you were in a private domain, or you were in a place where there's an eruv, which effectively is like a private domain, so you can't wear the sandal, it won't stay on your foot anymore, but you could pick it up and and bring it home, and so that you could fix it after Shabbos, or you could pick it up out of your yard and take it inside. If the outer strap of the sandal breaks, in other words, it has such a damage that it's no longer a sandal. It can't be used as a sandal. It's so broken that it is effectively not the utensil it was intended, that it was created to be. At that point, it is a different object. It is not a sandal anymore, legally speaking, because it just can't be used as a sandal. It's like been transformed into some other object. This other object, for purposes of tahor and tumah, right, for purposes of ritual purity and impurity, it's a new object. So that if it was impure before, because let's say you stepped on a creeping thing, and so it acquired the tumah from the creeping thing through treading, meaning you walked on the impurity. So then the sandal would become impure. The sandal became impure. Now that it's so broken that it's no longer a sandal, it is pure. It no longer has the impurity that it picked up before, because the sandal picked up the impurity. This new thing is not a sandal. It's just a piece of leather, but it's no longer usable as a sandal. In that case, it is not prepared for Shabbos under the law of muktzeh, right? This is a new object. It just essentially came into being on Shabbos, similar to an egg that was laid on Shabbos. It wasn't prepared for Shabbos, so you can't touch it. So when the outer strap breaks, when it stops being a sandal, so now you can't touch it. It's not prepared for use on Shabbos. You can't pick it up and move it. That's something that you leave alone and you come back and get it after Shabbos, right? That's the difference between just a little break. That means it won't stay on your foot, but it's still a sandal, and a major break that turns it into not a sandal anymore, legally speaking. Now, Rabbi Yochanan, hold on a second. Okay, so that's the basic principle, that if it can have such a major break that it's not going to be a sandal anymore. Now, what's interesting is that what if it doesn't break like that? It's like a total break, right? What if first the back of the sandal breaks, and then you repair it, and then later the front of the sandal breaks, and you repair that? When the back was broken, it was still a sandal, recognizably a sandal, because the front was still together. And then you fixed it. Then the front of the sandal breaks. So like it had two breakages in separate instances, and the first one was fixed before the second breakage happened. But at that point, it's like you had to replace the back of the sandal, and now you're going to replace the front of the sandal. And so it has become a whole new sandal. Right? It's almost, I don't know, it's like, just imagine an object where like you're holding on to some appliance, and like over time you replace so many parts of that appliance, an oven or a washer or a dryer or something, that at the end of the day, it's like you might as well have bought a whole new one because you've replaced every single part in it. If that happens with a sandal, it's now a whole new sandal. The question is, can it retain any of the impurity? Because it didn't all happen at once. So if it became impure because you walked on something, some source of tumah, then the back broke and you replaced the back. Now, it didn't become not a sandal. It was only half broken, and then you fixed it. So the tumah that was in that sandal essentially spreads from the part that you didn't replace to the part that you did replace. And then when you break the front half and replace that, the tumah spreads back to the new place from the first replacement. What's the net effect? You've now replaced the whole sandal. So in this, it is pure in the sense that it is a new object, right? So it will not be able to transmit tumah. It's not going to have the level of tumah that it had before all this replacing went on. But the sandal itself, it's not going to transmit tumah to someone else, right? Like if you're wearing it or, it touches something else, It will not transmit its ritual impurity to some other person or object, but it's going to retain the impurity that it acquired from that first time that you stepped on the impure thing. Rabbi Yochanan challenges this ruling. He says, wait a minute. We learned that with regard to vessels, so and specifically a wooden vessel. So imagine like a big wooden salad bowl, okay? Now, if a big wooden salad bowl becomes impure, it's going to be a problem. And like the only way for that wooden salad bowl that captures this tuma to become pure, to become a new object, is if there's a hole in it that's large enough for a pomegranate to pass through. Right? So if there's a big enough hole in that wooden bowl that a pomegranate could pass through it, then essentially that wooden bowl is no longer a wooden bowl. It's some new object, and whatever impurity the wooden bowl had before, it's gone. Now it's pure. It's a new object. What's interesting about that is, let's say it never had a hole in it that was the size of a pomegranate, but it had a hole in it the size of an olive, and then they fixed the hole. And then it got another hole the size of an olive, and then they fixed the hole. When there's enough of those holes that were made and fixed that they add up to the area of a hole that a pomegranate could pass through, then even though it happened one at a time and they were fixed along the way, now enough of it has been replaced, holes have been made and replaced, that they add up to the hole the size of the pomegranate, and it's a new bowl. And whatever impurity it had before, it is lost. Now that bowl has become pure. It doesn't retain any of the old impurity that it had before. So Rabbi Yochanan says, why is the sandal that was fixed in two stages, first the front, then the back, why does it retain some measure of the impurity that it had before the two replacements, whereas the wooden bowl that was replaced one little piece at a time loses all the impurity that it had before? That's the question. It's a great question. It's not really answered in the discussion. The fact is, the sandal does retain some of that impurity. The bowl doesn't. But young Rabbi Yochanan, we had a whole show. You can find it, in the AT Daily archived episodes at accidentaltalmudist.org on the life of Rabbi Yochanan, and such a beautiful, colorful, amazing life. Clearly, this was a question he asked when he was very young, right? So this was the young and precocious Rabbi Yochanan, and he impressed one of the older sages, Chizkiah, right? So Chizkiah, when he heard Rabbi Yochanan's question, let me read to you what Chizkiah said in reply. Chizkiah was so impressed by Rabbi Yochanan's comment that he exclaimed about him, "This is not a human being, but an angel." And if you were here at the beginning of class when I described the work that Sarah Bremen is doing in Mexico City, delivering challahs to senior citizens who are shut in, isolated, and have had no connection to people in a long time, and to Judaism sometimes in decades, and how it brings tears to their eyes that somebody is thinking about them and delivering this beautiful package of a challah. Hold on a second. Let me just show you this. This is what Sarah undertakes to deliver to people. She just does this on her own. Okay, it's not like she's working with some organization. It's just her, and she's delivered 300 of these beautiful homemade challahs with the candles and the grape juice, and she sends them to these, senior citizens who are just crying with joy to receive such a package. So, like Chizkiah's comment to Rabbi Yochanan, not a human being, but an angel. Some say that Chizkiah said, this is an ideal human being. And now that we're talking about the praise of the sages, we get another little digression. On a similar note, Rabbi Zera said that Rava bar Zimuna said, if the early generations are characterized as sons of angels, we are the sons of men. And if the early generations are characterized as the sons of men, we are akin to donkeys. And I do not mean that we are akin to either the donkey of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa or the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who were both extraordinarily intelligent donkeys. Rather, we are akin to other typical donkeys. What are they saying here? What is it that Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rava bar Zimuna? This is a very important principle within Jewish wisdom and within the Jewish tradition. In the popular culture these days, there is some kind of a philosophy, maybe even a bias would be a better way to put it, that, younger, newer people know more than older people from previous generations. Because, modern people have the benefit of technology and they're younger and hipper, and old-fashioned people, they don't really know anything, right? Their stuff is out of date, expired. Their wisdom is expired. The Jewish tradition teaches exactly the opposite. The older people are, and the closer they are in time to the revelation at Mount Sinai, the more they know, the wiser they are, the more we should listen to them, the closer they were to that greatest moment in human history, and the more illuminated and enlightened they were. These sages are teaching that we have a sense that knowledge has been lost, that the acme of human wisdom and understanding was when God revealed God's self and the essence and purpose of the whole universe to 2 million people at Sinai. They had a higher level of prophecy. There's a saying that a handmaid, like a servant, a household servant who happened to be crossing the Red Sea along with the 2 million Jews who were leaving Egypt in the Exodus, they had a higher level of prophecy than every prophet that came in the generations since then. It's like the heavens were open to them. And so that generation, they knew so much. And that was the generation that built the golden calf. It's even with all that knowledge, they still strayed wildly and committed a great, great sin. There's no guarantee that wisdom will protect us from sin, but it helps. And we have enormous respect for our elders, enormous respect for the history and for the tradition. And while we may have technologies available now that weren't available then, we look back on our ancestors and think they knew so much. And I alluded to this a few days ago when I said, it may well be that because the world was younger then, closer to the time when God created the world, that reality was a little bit more supple, a little bit more fluid then. And these people had a greater understanding of what goes into creation, what are the causes and effects and the principles of good and evil in this world, of love, of anger, resentment, of the emotions, the strengths, all the attributes that make us human. There have been aspects of that were lost, right? And so the sages will look back on the wisdom of earlier generations and praise it and long for that wisdom with all their hearts. And that's why they say, if the earlier generations were sons of angels, we are sons of men. And if the earlier generations were sons of men, then we are sons of donkeys. And we don't mean donkeys like the donkey of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa or the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. Those donkeys come up several times in the Talmud. We'll encounter them, God willing, in our journey. And these were donkeys that were actually very wise, and they would instinctively know to eat food only if it had been tithed, right? Because like a food that has not been tithed is not available. It can't be eaten, not even by our animals. Usually the animals don't know. They just eat what's in front of them. But the donkey of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa would know if food had been tithed or not and would refuse to eat it if it had not been tithed properly. Okay. Uh, and lastly, in the concepts that we're going to cover in today's class, the Mishnah finished by saying that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov taught that one may tie a rope in front of an animal so that it will not go out on Shabbos. Now, earlier we learned that you can't trap an animal on Shabbos, but this is different. This is not the case where a deer wandered into a house and you closed the door behind it, and so you effectively trapped a wild animal. When we're talking about just domesticated animals who, live in a part of the yard or in a stall, and you just have like a single rope that you put in front of them and the animal knows not to leave, so that's a knot that you certainly can tie or untie on Shabbos. This seems obvious. The Gemara says, why do you mention it? Because it might be that you have two ropes in front of the animal and one rope always stays tied, or you have two knots in that rope and one knot always stays tied and the other one is the one that you typically tie and untie to let the animal in and out. Well, if you untie that other knot that is rarely used to open or close, that is akin to the, a woman's robe, that even if it has two openings and one knot she never uses and the other one is what she typically uses, still this knot is meant to be tied and untied, and it is permitted to tie this rope in front of the animal. And this is the halacha. Now, Abaye and Rav Yosef are discussing this ruling of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov about that rope, and then Abaye asks, well, why does it say that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov rules that we can do that? Do the other rabbis agree with him or disagree with him? What is the halacha? If everybody agrees, why is this a teaching of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? And Rav Yosef says, no. The halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. You can tie or untie either end of the rope in front of the animal. And Abaye says, okay, I get it. But what about the other rabbis? Do they agree with him or not? And so Rav Yosef says, well, what do you care? I'm telling you, and it says here that the halacha is with Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. We don't need to know whether the other rabbis agree or disagree. The fact is, the law is according to this ruling. And Abaye answers Rav Yosef, and I'll just read it. Abaye says to Rav Yosef says, what difference is there to you whether or not the rabbis disagree? In either case, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Abaye answered Rav Yosef using a folk expression. Is it simply learn the lesson, let it be like a song? In other words, is it sufficient to simply parrot the halachic ruling? Rather, it is necessary to examine the issue and to understand it, even if it does not yield a practical difference. In other words, we're not just here to learn what the law is. I always try to tell you what the halacha is when these questions come up so that we would know what to do in our lives today. But the takeaway from this, and this is the answer to the person who said yesterday, is this trivial or not? That the answer is that we want to understand how these rulings were arrived at. Because when we dig into the law and look for those lessons and try to understand so that we're not just singing it, we're not just parroting the law to show that we know it, but rather we want to dig in and say, well, what is God teaching us? Why has God limited us in this way? Or why has God commanded us to do this thing? And sometimes the law is irrational and there's no real explanation why God said so except that God said so. But even though we may not know why God said so, we do seek to understand, well, now that God has said that, what kind of implications is that going to have in our lives? At the very least, we're going to teach ourselves to think and to make distinctions. So much of what's going on in the world today is people saying, everybody's the same, everyone should have the same, be the same, do the same, act the same. God has told us different. We are all different. We are all unique. There are many differences among us, between us, in our families, in our communities, between us on Monday and on Saturday. So much of what we do in Torah study and Talmudic learning is about drawing distinctions and training our minds to understand carefully what the differences are between one thing or another. Well, some would say that that is the secret to Jewish success over the last 3,000 years, because we train ourselves to see the distinctions between one thing and another. Let's answer some questions and comments. Edberg says, but what about a permanent shoe or sandal knot that might come undone and then leaves the shoe unwearable? I mean, that's an excellent question. It really is. So you're saying, well, the sages kind of left these knots that they never tie and untie, and then they're out walking around, and that particular knot that was never meant to be a permanent knot, it's just that they didn't tie it or untie it, generally speaking, and it became untied. Can they tie that knot? I'm not sure. You're certainly not going to be liable for a Torah prohibition. And so is this violating a rabbinic decree? My guess, and I'm not sure, I think you really need to ask somebody else or research the question more thoroughly. My guess is ab initio, right? As a starting point, no. But now that it has come undone and there's no Torah violation, and the fact that it became undone demonstrates that it's not a permanent knot, I think maybe then you can make just a simple loose knot, because we know we can make those knots, right? The knot that we're making is the new knot. The old one came out and I didn't untie it. The new knot that I'm making, it's not meant to be permanent and extend beyond Shabbos. It's just meant to get me home, and it's a simple knot. So I would guess you can make that knot to get yourself home. Edberg says, I'm talking about the stitching. Now it's really problematic. If you're talking about the stitching just to get yourself home, some kind of repair, now I'm thinking no. Maybe you could make maybe it's like in the stitching, because there is a teaching here that in a carmelis, which is neither private domain nor public domain, that the sandal breaks, you could make some kind of a temporary thing to hold it together with a wet reed that is edible. And I'm not sure, I haven't thought all that through and what exactly that means. But could you do something temporary to get yourself home? I don't know. I think you can make just a simple knot with the straps. Could you do it with the stitching? I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. Bill Eldridge says, but let us say that the civil law says that abandoning your broken sandal in the thoroughfare, let us say that your sandal broke when on the public sidewalk. Let us say that leaving it there would be regarded as littering and you would be fined. May you then remove the broken sandal to, say, a trash bin as part of obeying the civil law custom of the land. Very interesting. Because we certainly have a concept of din ha'eretz. The law of the land is the law. And you would certainly not want to be a visible Jew, right, walking around with a kippah like you're on Team Hashem, and then litter. That would be really bad. That would be a Chilul Hashem. That would be desecrating the name. So maybe what you would do in such a case is you would move the object, less than 4 cubits at a time to show that you really understand that you can't carry in the public domain. You're just moving it to the garbage. Maybe you would pick it up in an atypical manner, like hold it like this with your pinky and thumb, not the way a person would normally pick up a shoe. Maybe. I'm not sure about that, but that would seem to be a way to deal with that situation. Bill Eldridge also says, does that mean that impurity somehow goes poof on the last puncture repair to the bowl? I'm with you, Rabbi Yochanan. This sounds fishy. No, but Rabbi Yochanan is not trying to say that it's wrong in the case of the bowl. He's saying the bowl is the bowl. Can't we extend that principle to the sandal? And the sandal should become totally pure again once you've replaced both the front and the back. He's not questioning that when enough holes are made in the bowl, even though you repaired it each time. Listen, some of these technicalities make us think, oh, wait a minute, I mean, they're just finding loopholes. And, Mendy Pellin has a character he calls the loopholer Rebbe. but the fact is, loopholes only exist because you understand the law well enough, to make use of them. And sometimes those loopholes have, incredible, beautiful importance, right? And there's a case, I didn't even read the story, but Nina told me about it, where there was a family, that there was a strange situation in that family. And, I think the mother remarried thinking that her husband was dead. And then the husband showed up again. And that meant that, she had children with another man while she was still married to the first husband. And that's very bad because then those kids are called mamzerim. That's a mamzer. It's a huge prohibition, and it's a very difficult status for the children to have. They're going to have a really tough time finding marriage partners in the religious community that they're accustomed to. So that family was desperately looking for some kind of a loophole, but some kind of a legal ruling based on some unusual circumstance in this whole story, so that the children would not be rendered mamzers, and so they could, have a normal life and get married in their own community. And Rabbi, Ovadia found that. He researched for days to find some kind of a ruling where they could get to the right result legally, through a legal Torah ruling. So that's understanding the law well enough to save lives. Carolyn Dobson Chavez says, what about Jeremiah? I'm sorry, I don't know what the question is. What about Jeremiah? Sharon Frant Brooks says, my uncle of blessed memory used to tell that in their shtetl in Poland, his grandfather would cross the street and go out of his way to give tzedakah to an old man because he was clearly so holy, because he was granted his long life by Hashem. Beautiful, beautiful, exactly right. And we should always remember that when people appear in our lives to ask us for tzedakah, to ask us for charity, they're doing us a favor, and they are functioning as a messenger of Hashem at that point. And when somebody has a need, and especially when somebody comes to you crying, so then you must allow yourself to be moved and to have compassion and to give what it's possible to give. Carolyn is saying, was Jeremiah not as wise as the earliest prophets? Now listen, when we get a teaching like this, there's also going to be some kind of, what's the word? Not exaggeration, but... I'm forgetting the word that I'm looking for. Maybe somebody will write it into the comments. But, making a point a little bit bigger so that you remember it. Okay? Yikes! What is the word for that? At any rate, they're speaking a little bit bombastically, shall we say. But on the other hand, it's also true. Later prophets, right, unlike Moses, their prophecy was in a vision or in a dream, right? And God says that. He says it in the Torah. With other prophets, I speak to them in a vision or in a dream. But with my servant Moses, I speak with him face to face. And Moses was up in Shemayim. He was in heaven when he ascended to receive the Torah. So in the time of Moses, there was a kind of prophecy available. Now, it was really only to Moses. However, when the people crossed through the Red Sea, our tradition teaches that it was not just that the water parted and then they went through on dry land. They were in a state where, heaven and earth were meeting in one place. Reality was completely fluid around them. And like the boundaries between this, hard physical world based on the atomic properties of, granite and carbon and iron and oxygen, etc. Those rules were all, malleable. They were malleable in the presence of the Lord, the immediate presence of the Lord. And so people who lived in that time saw things, experienced things that no one would see again, even a prophet as exalted and wise as Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel, who were, so far beyond anything that we could imagine or say or do. Their wisdom was so much greater than ours. And yet, that earlier generation is quite a bit earlier. When you're comparing Isaiah to the Exodus or Jeremiah to the Exodus, Isaiah was late First Temple. Jeremiah saw the fall of the First Temple. So you're talking about, that's about 800 years later than the people who were there at the Exodus. And they didn't have access to what those people at the Exodus witnessed. So in that sense, Jeremiah didn't have the kind of prophecy that even the simplest person had when they exited Egypt. Hyperbole. Thank you, Lynn. That's the word I was looking for. Sometimes the sages engage in hyperbole to make sure you get the message. Okay, my friends, that is what I've got for us today. I am wishing you such a sweet Shabbos. May you be enveloped in the peace, the light, the beauty, the joy of Shabbos, as if we were all together at the base of Mount Sinai together.